In the late 1800s, there was one man on earth who legally owned an entire country. Not ruled it, not governed it, but owned it, personally, like a house or a car or a piece of furniture. That country was 76 times the size of Belgium, the tiny European kingdom he actually ruled. And to keep that country running, his men cut off hands. Thousands of them, sometimes from children. Leopold was born in 1835, the second son of Belgium's very first king, Leopold I. Belgium had only become an independent nation in 1830, just 5 years before Leopold was born. It was small, it was new, and it was sandwiched between France, Germany, and the Netherlands like a doormat between three giants. By all accounts, young Leopold was awkward, intensely intellectual, and obsessed with one subject above all others: money. Specifically, other countries' money, and how they were making so much of it from their colonies. Leopold actually had deep connections with two of Europe's most powerful colonizers, Britain and France. His father, Leopold I, was the maternal uncle of Queen Victoria, and was often described as her favorite. Meanwhile, his mother, Louise Marie of Orleans, was a French princess from the powerful House of Orleans. So even though Belgium was a small new country, Leopold grew up surrounded by Europe's royal elite. In his early years, he traveled through places like Egypt and other parts of the Asia, where European empires were already extracting vast wealth. He saw Britain and other colonial powers building fortunes overseas. And in that world, a single idea began forming in his head. Belgium needed a colony of its own. So he began looking. He showed interest in acquiring Philippines from Spain. They refused. He looked at parts of Argentina like the Patagonia region, unaware that Argentina was already an independent nation and was mainly looking for European immigrants and investments. He tried pushing the idea to Belgium's politicians, arguing that Belgium needed a colony of its own. But most were not convinced. They believed colonies are too expensive and risky, and that Belgium was doing fine through trade with other nations, and refused to fund his idea. While Leopold was on his quest, the one part of the world map that was still mostly blank to Europeans was the interior of Central Africa. The coastlines were mapped, but the middle of the continent was still a mystery to the eyes of Europeans. And that mystery was the Congo River Basin. Leopold saw the opportunity immediately. He set up something called the International African Association. Its intention on paper was about scientific explorations, humanitarian missions, ending the East African slave trade and bringing civilization to Central Africa. But behind these, his actual intentions were otherwise. Leopold understood that if he presented himself as a man bringing civilization and ending slavery in Central Africa, other European powers would be less suspicious of his real goal, which is gaining influence and control over the Congo. But to actually get into the Congo, he needed an explorer. Around the same time, another name was making headlines across the world for mapping the Congo region. His name was Henry Morton Stanley. But Stanley's own story began far from the jungles of Africa. Born in Wales in 1841, his real name was John Rowlands. His childhood was filled with hardship. After being abandoned by his mother, he spent much of his early life in a workhouse. As a teenager, he eventually crossed the Atlantic to America, where he reinvented himself and took the name Henry Morton Stanley after a wealthy New Orleans merchant who had taken him in. Years later, Stanley claimed that his childhood was extremely traumatic and difficult. Then, shortly after the Civil War had ended in USA, he switched to journalism and writing and eventually landed in the New York Herald, which assigned him to go find the missing Scottish explorer David Livingstone, who had gone missing in Central Africa after going there as a Christian missionary. Stanley started a massive expedition to find Livingstone, starting from the island of Zanzibar with hundreds of porters, African guides, soldiers, and supplies. After traveling for months, he eventually reached the town of Uji on the shores of Lake Tanganyika in November 1871, where he saw an old, sick European man. He approached him and asked his most iconic phrase, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume?" And it was, in fact, Dr. Livingstone. He became a literal celebrity worldwide after this, and that quickly caught the attention of Leopold. In 1879, Leopold quietly hired him and sent him back to the Congo, not to explore this time but to negotiate. Stanley approached local chiefs with gifts and promises of trade and protection, asking them to sign treaties on behalf of Leopold. But these agreements were written in European legal language and carried meanings that many of the chiefs did not fully understand. What they saw as alliances or agreements with a foreign power, Leopold later used as claims of ownership over huge parts of the Congo. But now the main problem was not acquiring massive chunk of Africa, but getting the rest of the world to recognize the ownership. So, between 1884 and 1885, the leader of Germany at the time, Otto von Bismarck, invited major European powers like France, Portugal, Britain and others for a conference in Berlin for discussing the matters of Africa, to avoid end up fighting each other. Leopold now presented himself as a humanitarian and as a man trying to fight East African slave trade, as said before, and gain the legitimacy for his control over Congo. Congo was full of dense forests and most importantly elephants and their ivory tusks. Ivory was used widely among upper-class Europeans back in those days in making of piano keys, billiard balls and knife handles and many more. Initially, there was cooperation and trade among the natives and Leopold's agents, but as the time went on, it became increasingly coercive and exploitative. He created an army called Force Publique which, ironically, mostly made up of Africans to control the huge Congo territory. Then the world took a big shift with the rise of automobile and bicycles in the 1890s. The demand for rubber skyrocketed. So did Leopold's atrocities. The Congo basin is filled with wild rubber vines, but he needed massive labor to cash in on the surging demand for rubber. He claimed large parts of Congo as part of the Congo Free State, and to get the amount of rubber he needed, he set daily quotas for every village and ordered his officials and Force Publique to enforce these demands, often against their will. Here's how the system usually worked. Men were forced to go deep into the wild for days and meet their quota on time. If a village failed to meet its quota, which happened a lot, the women and children of those men were held hostage to make men go deeper and get more rubber. Soldiers in the Force Publique were required to present a hand as proof for every bullet they used, supposedly to prevent mutinies and selling of bullets. So, soldiers who mistakenly wasted bullets, or who wanted to save them for other purposes, cut off the hands of living people instead, including children, just to produce proof to their superiors. What makes it even more disturbing is that Leopold never even visited the Congo. He controlled all these atrocities from his chair back in Belgium. Like every man has his day, Leopold's day came when a man named Edmund Morel, who worked for a shipping company called Elder Dempster, noticed something unusual. Ships would arrive from Congo filled with valuable rubber and ivory, but go back filled with guns, bullets and soldiers. He eventually deduced what was actually happening there. Morel left his job to become a journalist to expose the atrocities happening in the Congo. At the same time, the British were receiving too many allegations of atrocities in Congo from missionaries and people like Morel. So, they send a man named Roger Casement to investigate the conditions in the Congo on behalf of the British government. The Casement report, published in 1904, laid out everything what was happening there. Photographs of the Congo circulated widely. Morel and Casement teamed up and founded Congo Reform Association, one of the first major international human rights campaigns in history. Many influential people worldwide started to highlight what was happening, including Joseph Conrad, who witnessed what happened in the Congo himself and wrote a fictional novel called Heart of Darkness, directly inspired by his own experiences there. Mark Twain also joined the global outrage, publishing a satirical pamphlet in 1905 titled King Leopold's Soliloquy, directly condemning King Leopold's rule in the Congo Free State. The pressure became a full-blown international scandal. Estimates of the death toll during Leopold's rule of the Congo, from violence, starvation, disease, and the collapse of communities under the forced labor system, range from several million to as high as 10 million people, though historians continue to debate the exact figures due to the lack of reliable records. Leopold died just less than a year later, in December 1909. His personal life in his final years was its own kind of scandal. His marriage to Queen Marie Henriette had been cold and distant for decades, and the two lived largely separate lives. After her death in 1902, he was publicly in a relationship with a teenager named Blanche Delacroix, which didn't sit well with the Belgian public at all. The Belgian Congo remained a colony for another 51 years, finally gaining independence in 1960 under its first prime minister, Patrice Lumumba. The early independence period was chaotic and marked by deep political instability. Lumumba was assassinated in January 1961 during a crisis that involved Belgian involvement and Cold War-era foreign interference. In the years that followed, the country spiraled into prolonged instability, eventually coming under the dictatorship of Mobutu Sese Seko, whose rule shaped much of the nation's modern history.